back in the cold, dank, stone castle jail on the remote penal island of Maya, run by the Spanish garrison on that island at that time, approximately 1856. And he sat there, having dispatched his little bird with the note and map that he had wrapped around the bird's feet. And all he could do was hope that the little bird landed in a place somewhere on Marty Island whereby somebody would see the note and the map and give it to the Bartlett family. That was his hope, and that is what he did. Now the question was, did his little friend, the bird, the dove, who he'd trained so meticulously and carefully for so many days, did he deliver? Did she deliver? He didn't even know whether it was he or she. Did she deliver the note? And did somebody in his family, at least, get it? While he was fretting over this, the door to his jail was opened, and the caretaker for the penal colony, General Espinosa, walked in with a soldier and said to Jim, "You've got 2 days. We're going to execute you exactly at 12 noon in 2 days. So get ready." And then he chuckled, his fat belly shaking, and the general left the jail cell. Jim settled back on his hard cot to think. And as he thought, with the warm breeze, Caribbean breeze, flowing through his tiny jail cell window, he felt lonely. He looked out and wondered where his little bird was. He wondered if he would come back. And at this moment, when Jim really had nothing to look at but the walls of his cell, he truly wished the little bird would come back, because it provided a sense of companionship that really wasn't available to him any other way. As he sat there, he remembered the glorious days back on his home island, and it was called Moon Island back then. And he remembered going up in a coconut tree and staying there most of the day, cracking open coconuts and drinking the sweet coconut milk inside. And he remembered laying back and then hearing his father call him to come for dinner, coming down, running across the farmland that their family owned, and then heading into the house there to see his mother and the warm smile of his father as they sat down to eat. For a moment, it was his hunger that was overtaking him, and he began to imagine the wonderful foods that his mother used to make. He thought for a second, I'm worse than a soldier out on a battlefield for months and months, longing to go home. And he chuckled to himself. Though Jim was a relatively tall man at 6 feet, he could hardly reach the cell window to look outside, and for a moment he suddenly wished he could just take a look at some blue sky and something other than the walls of his cell. So he stood up and stood on tiptoes and looked outside. It's the same scene he had gotten used to for the last 3 weeks. But this time he felt himself longing for the little bird to return, without the note attached to his foot, which Jim would assume is a confirmation that at least somebody got the note, and perhaps somebody would be able to get it to his family. As he sat gazing out the window, only 2 days before his execution, Jim Bartlett, father of 2 girls living on Marty Island, husband of the lovely Miss Lizzie Bartlett, he began to feel desperation and sadness that he had never felt before. He wanted so much to see his family. He wanted so much to know that they were okay. And yet, for all he knew, the authorities had already found out about his family, which he had kept so secret from everybody, except the locals on Marty Island. And his greatest fear, of course, was that the same authorities who had arrested him and put him in jail would then go after the rest of his family. Jim was extremely frustrated. And then in the midst of this doom and gloom, this sadness, this pessimism, all of a sudden, he looked up at the sky and a sharp light came to him. The guard who brought his dinner every night had to open the cell to get in. And although it was a rather disgusting dinner of gruel and half-stale bread, it did keep him alive. He had focused so much on the poor quality of the food and surviving that he had forgotten and neglected, completely ignored the fact that this was a man, this guard coming in, was a person that he could potentially get to allow him to leave. He looked out his cell window. It was almost noon, and the guard was coming across the lawn outside, 2 stories below, and heading for his jail cell holding a tray of food. Jim knew this was his lunch. Suddenly, Jim got an inspiration. He said, I know I can take this guy. And if I do, and I do it silently enough, perhaps, I can escape. Jim knew he could be killed, too, in the process. But then again, he was going to be executed in a couple days anyway. Why not give it a try? And so Jim Bartlett resolved at that moment to overtake the guard and stealthily leave the castle prison and head down to the shoreline where he would try to find a boat to escape with. As audacious as the plan sounded, Jim was fully committed to it, and he truly believed that somehow maybe Providence would smile upon him, and yes, he would be able to leave the island and go back and see his family. Jim was a little surprised at his emotions. He took a look at himself, almost like he was standing aside and observing himself, and he said, I haven't thought for 1 second about my crew, about being a pillaging pirate, about my ship, about any of my life of crime. It's so funny, isn't it? And he chuckled to himself. When your life is about to end, all you can think about is your family. He smiled to himself. Yep, it's true. Just then, Jim heard some footsteps coming up the long, dank stairs that led up to his cell, and he knew it was the guard. Jim stretched his hands and legs so he could get maximum force from them, sat on the edge of his bed as he always did at this time of day, and the guard entered, grunting and saying nothing more, took out his long key and opened up the door of the cell because it was the only way to get the tray into the jail cell. As he did so, Jim didn't give away that it was anything other than a normal day, and he sat, looked up at him, looked down at the food like he always did. And then once the tray was being placed on the small wooden table in his cell, Jim instantly rose and immediately slapped with a full fist the head of the guard. The guard was shocked and reeled backwards. Blackjack then took his foot and kicked the man in the stomach and then brought it both hands down on his head, and he collapsed unconscious. Now, Jim's only concern was, did anybody hear that? He looked around. He was the only prisoner in that floor of the jail at that time. He didn't see anything. This was the only guard he ever knew standing near his cell or in charge of his cell. He felt that perhaps there was no one else in here. He didn't see anybody coming across the green. So for a brief moment, he said to himself, maybe I'm going to make this. Maybe it's going to be okay. With very careful, cat-like steps, Jim headed down the stairs. Some of them were a bit slippery from the dampness in the castle, but he very carefully tiptoed out the door. There was nobody else there. Everyone considered that particular jail to be so remote, it's a small island, that there was very little concern about any security. Other than a nice tight jail cell and at least one guard, nobody had ever felt there was a need for anything more, and nobody had ever escaped until Jim. Once outside, he looked over to the rather fancy cottage owned by the Generalissimo as his reward for being appointed penal commissioner on that little tiny island. And he saw that Espinosa was nowhere to be seen. He was not playing around in his garden, not puttering around in his garden, which he sometimes did, Jim had observed. And he was not outside, and he was not concerned. He must be inside eating, he said. There was only a small number of guards on the island, again, because no one thought anybody could ever break in and release any prisoners. So Jim knew that if he could get past the house, that's where the guards would be, then he would be able to head down to the shoreline, maybe find a boat, and then get away. Quickly, he passed through the trees. He found a small path that led down to the seaside, keeping his eyes open at all times to avoid any passersby or any fishermen or anybody around that island who might be able to see him. He quietly tiptoed down to the shoreline and then began looking around to see if anybody had tethered any boats to any of the docks or any of the spots around there. And to his enjoyment and satisfaction and great pleasure, a small rowboat was located just a few feet from where he came out on the trail. He looked around. Nobody was there. No ships were on the horizon. He went down and grabbed the boat and dragged it into the water, immediately got in and began rowing the oars far to move away from the island. In about 30 minutes, he was far enough away that nobody could spot him from the penal island. And he felt like he had a chance to get back home now. The only problem, it was a very long way back home, more than 40 miles. And he would have to figure out a way to get there without any water, without any food, with no help from anyone. He was going to have to row his way all the way back to at least an island where he could get some food and shelter and then take off the next day. But in doing so, he could easily compromise his position and could be rearrested. So it was a very careful Jim who took to the boat that day. The sea was calm. If this was a